The Pacific stretched endlessly beneath Admiral Chester William Nimitz as he stood in the communications center at Pearl Harbor, his weathered hands gripping a decoded Japanese message that would change the course of World War II. The intercepted transmission spoke of AF, the Japanese code name for Midway Atoll, and plans for a massive assault that would supposedly draw out and destroy the remaining American Pacific Fleet. Commander Joseph John Rochefort, head of Station Hypo, had been working around the clock with his cryptanalysts to break the Japanese naval code JN-25. Their breakthrough came when they confirmed that AF indeed referred to Midway by orchestrating a clever ruse, having Midway radio in plain text that their water purification system had broken down. Within hours, Japanese communications intercepted mentioned that AF was short on fresh water. The Japanese plan, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was audacious in its scope. The combined fleet would split into multiple task forces. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's First Air Fleet would strike Midway with 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, while Yamamoto himself would follow with the main battle fleet, including the massive battleship Yamato. A separate force would simultaneously attack the Aleutian Islands to divide American attention. Context referenced from Samuel Eliot Morrison's History of United States Naval Operations in World War II. What Yamamoto didn't know was that Nimitz had positioned his entire available fleet to intercept them. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance aboard the carrier Enterprise, would work in coordination with Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher on the Yorktown. The Yorktown had been hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor after being damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. Work that should have taken months was completed in 72 hours. As dawn broke on June 4th, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey prepared his squadron of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers aboard the Enterprise. The pilots knew they faced overwhelming odds. The Japanese had more carriers, more experienced pilots, and had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. Yet something felt different this time. For once, they would not be reacting to Japanese moves, but anticipating them. On the Japanese flagship Akagi, Commander Minoru Genda reviewed the flight plans with growing confidence. Their strike force of 108 aircraft, Kate torpedo bombers, Val dive bombers, and Zero fighters would devastate Midway's defenses, clearing the way for invasion. The Americans, they believed, were still reeling from months of defeats across the Pacific. Neither side fully grasped that they were about to engage in what historians would later call the turning point of the Pacific War, a battle where superior intelligence, desperate courage, and split-second timing would prove more decisive than numerical advantage. The stage was set for an encounter that would see the sun rise on Japanese naval supremacy and set on American determination to reclaim the Pacific. June 4th, 1942, 04:30 hours. The pre-dawn darkness over the Central Pacific shattered as Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched his first strike from 240 miles northwest of Midway. 108 Japanese aircraft roared into the sky from the flight decks of 4 carriers, their engines creating a symphony of impending destruction. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the formation toward the tiny coral atoll that had become the focal point of imperial ambitions. At Midway itself, radar operator Private Joseph McDonald spotted the incoming formation at 5:45 hours, still 93 miles out. The klaxons wailed across Eastern Island as every available American aircraft scrambled into the morning sky. Major Lofton Russell Henderson led 27 obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters and 7 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters to intercept, knowing full well they were flying into a massacre. The aerial combat that followed was brutal and one-sided. The Japanese Zero fighters, piloted by veterans with hundreds of combat hours, systematically destroyed the American defenders. Henderson himself was shot down and killed, along with 13 other pilots. Only 2 Buffaloes returned to base, both badly damaged. The path to Midway lay wide open. At 06:30 hours, Tominaga's bombers swept over Midway like avenging angels. High explosive bombs and incendiaries rained down on the airfields, fuel dumps, and installations. The powerhouse exploded in a ball of flame. The mess hall disintegrated, and the runway cratered under direct hits. Yet the Marines on the ground, led by Colonel Harold Shannon, kept their anti-aircraft guns firing throughout the attack. Context referenced from Gordon Prang's Miracle. At Midway. Despite the devastation, Midway remained operational. More critically for Japanese plans, Tominaga radioed back to Nagumo at 0700 hours with an ominous message. There is need for a second attack wave. The airfields were damaged, but not destroyed, and American aircraft were still taking off from the battered runways. This single transmission would prove catastrophic for Japanese fortunes. Nagumo faced a terrible dilemma. His second-wave aircraft were already armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for anti-ship operations, expecting to engage the American fleet when it appeared. Switching to land attack bombs would take precious time, leaving his carriers vulnerable. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Nagumo, American dive bombers from Midway were already searching for his fleet. Major Lofton Russell Henderson's namesake. Major Lofton Russell Henderson, Jr., led 16 Douglas SBD Dauntless bombers through the scattered clouds, hunting for the Japanese carriers. At 0705 hours, they spotted the enemy formation, 4 carriers arranged in a box formation with their escorting cruisers and destroyers. The attack was courageously pressed but tactically disastrous. The SBDs dove through intense anti-aircraft, fire and swarms of Zero fighters. Captain Richard Eugene Fleming's bomber was hit repeatedly, but continued its dive, crashing into the cruiser Makuma's afterturret. Most of the Marine pilots never returned, their sacrifice seemingly in vain as no carriers were damaged. Yet their attack served a crucial purpose. It kept the Japanese combat air patrol at low altitude and distracted Nagumo's attention at the precise moment when Admiral Spruance's Task Force 16 was launching its own strike from the Enterprise and Hornet, now just 200 miles away. The Marines had unknowingly set the stage for one of naval history's most decisive moments. June 4, 1942. 800 hours aboard the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced the most critical decision of his career. His flight decks bustled with frantic activity as ordnance crews worked to rearm his second-wave aircraft with land attack bombs for another strike on Midway. The armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes meant for enemy ships were hastily moved below deck, creating dangerous bottlenecks of explosive materials throughout his carriers. At airweight 20 hours, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone finally radioed the message that changed everything. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships in position 10 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo's blood ran cold. The American fleet, which Japanese intelligence insisted wouldn't arrive for days, was already within striking distance. Lieutenant Commander John Clarence Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, had spotted the Japanese formation first. His 15 obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers approached at wave-top level, their slow speed making them sitting ducks for the swarming Zero fighters. Waldron knew the odds. In his final letter to his wife, he had written, "If I don't come back, know that I went down fighting." The slaughter was swift and merciless. One by one, Waldron's Devastators fell burning into the Pacific. Zero fighters dove repeatedly, their machine guns and cannons tearing through the unarmored American aircraft. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 torpedo bombers were destroyed. Only Ensign George Holden Gay survived, floating in the water amid the wreckage, watching the battle unfold from his life raft. Context referenced from Walter Lord's Incredible Victory. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown followed, meeting similar fates. Of 41 torpedo bombers launched that morning, only 4 would return to their carriers. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol had seemingly annihilated the American attack, but the sacrifice of these brave airmen was about to pay an unexpected dividend. At 10:20 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, found himself running low on fuel and seemingly lost over the empty Pacific. Following his instincts and training, he continued southwest, reasoning that any Japanese ships would be steaming toward Midway. His persistence paid off when he spotted the white wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward. The Arashi, hurrying to catch up with Nagumo's carriers after depth charging a suspected American submarine. Following the destroyer's wake like a highway in the sky, McCluskey's bombers climbed to 14,000 feet. Below them, Nagumo's carriers were caught at their most vulnerable moment. The torpedo attacks had drawn all the Zero fighters down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. Worse, all 4 carrier flight decks were crowded, with fully fueled and armed aircraft, preparing for their own strike against the newly discovered American fleet. At exactly 10:22 hours, McCluskey rolled his Dauntless into its dive, followed by his entire squadron. The Japanese lookout screamed warnings, but it was already too late. The American dive bombers plummeted earthward like avenging angels, their Wright Cyclone engines howling as they built up speed. In the next 4 minutes, the course of the Pacific War would be decided by the accuracy of American bombing and the explosive volatility of aviation gasoline. June 4th, 1942, 10:22 hours. The screaming dive of 37 Dauntless bombers created a sound unlike anything the Japanese sailors had ever heard. A mechanical banshee wail that announced the arrival of death from above. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's formation split into 2 groups, one targeting the flagship Akagi, the other diving toward the veteran carrier Kaga. Aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge watching in horror as American dive bombers materialized out of the morning sun. The carrier's flight deck was a nightmare of vulnerability. 36 fully fueled aircraft spotted for takeoff, their wings loaded with bombs and torpedoes, fuel lines snaking across the deck like arteries filled with high-octane blood. Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best, leading the Enterprise's bombing Squadron 6, selected Akagi as his personal target. His 1,000-pound bomb struck just behind the carrier's bridge, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among the parked aircraft below. The detonation triggered a chain reaction of catastrophic explosions as aviation gasoline ignited, ammunition cooked off, and torpedo warheads added their own devastating contributions to the inferno. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin, Leslie's bombers from Yorktown had found their own target, the carrier Soryu. Leslie's own bomb release mechanism had malfunctioned during launch, leaving him weaponless, but his squadron pressed their attacks with deadly precision. 3 direct hits transformed Soryu into a floating crematorium within minutes. Context referenced from Mitsuo Fuchida's Midway, the battle that doomed Japan. The carrier Kaga suffered perhaps the worst fate of all, multiple bomb hits along. Her flight deck created a hellscape of exploding aircraft and burning fuel. Commander Takahisa Amagai, Kaga's captain, found himself trapped on a bridge surrounded by walls of flame. The ship's island structure became a furnace, and within 30 minutes the order came to abandon ship. In exactly 4 minutes, from 10:22 to 10:26 hours, 3 of Japan's 4 most experienced aircraft carriers had been transformed from instruments of imperial power into burning pyres. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been hidden by clouds and escaped the initial attack, but her turn was coming. Captain Mark Andrew Mitcher, commanding the USS Hornet, received McCluskey's electrifying radio message at 10:30 hours. 3 carriers, burning. The message flashed across the American task forces like wildfire. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces had struck a decisive blow against the Imperial Japanese Navy. But the battle was far from over. Hiryu's Captain Tomeo Kaku immediately launched 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters under Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, seeking revenge against the American carriers. At 12:05 hours, Kobayashi's formation found Yorktown and pressed home their attack with the same deadly precision that had characterized Japanese operations throughout the war. 3 bombs struck Admiral Fletcher's flagship. The first hit near the island structure, killing or wounding 66 men and knocking out the radar. The second bomb penetrated deep into the ship's bowels, starting fires near the forward magazines. The third bomb damaged the flight deck and hangar bay. Yorktown's speed dropped to 6 knots as damage control parties fought to save the ship. Yet even as Yorktown burned, her remaining aircraft were already hunting for Hiryu. The last act of this drama would be played out between the sole surviving Japanese carrier and the vengeful American air crews who had just witnessed their comrades' deaths. The Japanese goals of destroying the American Pacific Fleet and seizing Midway were indeed disintegrating in the flames of their own carriers, But Admiral Yamamoto's remaining forces would not surrender without extracting a final, terrible price. June 4th, 1942, 1400 hours. Captain Tomeo Kaku stood on Hiryu's bridge, the last Japanese carrier captain still in the fight, surrounded by the smoke columns of his burning consorts rising like funeral pyres on the horizon. His ship had become the sole repository of Japanese naval aviation's hopes in the Central Pacific, and he intended to make the Americans pay dearly for their morning's success. At 13:31 hours, Kaku launched his second and final strike, 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters under Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto. These were the last experienced carrier pilots in his air group, men who had attacked Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Ceylon. They flew toward the American fleet with the desperate courage of samurai facing inevitable death. Meanwhile, aboard the damaged USS Yorktown, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria, leaving Captain Elliot Buckmaster to fight for his ship's survival. Damage control teams had worked miracles. The carrier was making 19 knots again and preparing to recover aircraft when Hashimoto's torpedo bombers appeared on the horizon. The attack was pressed with suicidal determination. Despite a wall of anti-aircraft fire and attacks by Wildcat fighters, 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side. The explosions flooded the engine rooms and knocked out electrical power throughout the ship. Buckmaster, believing his ship was doomed, gave the order to abandon ship at 14:55 hours. Context referenced from John B. Lundstrom's The First Team. But even as Yorktown listed heavily to port, her orphaned aircraft were already seeking revenge. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie had transferred his remaining bombers to Enterprise, and at 14:30 hours, 24 Dauntless dive bombers launched to hunt down Hiryu. The Japanese carrier fought alone now, her escort reduced by the morning's battles. When the American bombers found her at 1700 hours, Captain Kaku ordered his ship to turn into the wind, hoping to launch his last few aircraft. It was a futile gesture. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's bombing squadron dove through moderate anti-aircraft fire and scored 4 direct hits. The bombs penetrated Hiryu's flight deck and exploded among the aircraft in her hangar bay. Aviation gasoline ignited in a familiar pattern, creating the same inferno that had consumed her sister ships. Within minutes, the last of Admiral Nagumo's carriers was transformed into a blazing wreck, her flight deck buckled and twisted by internal explosions. As night fell on June 4th, Admiral Yamamoto aboard the battleship Yamato faced the unthinkable reality that his carefully planned operation had become a catastrophic defeat. 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers were gone, along with their experienced air crews. The dream of destroying the American Pacific Fleet and seizing Midway had literally gone up in smoke. At 02:55 hours on June 5th, Yamamoto transmitted the order that acknowledged Japan's first major naval defeat. The Midway operation is canceled. His massive fleet, including 11 battleships and dozens of cruisers and destroyers, began the long retreat toward Japan. The hunter had become the hunted, and the rising sun was setting on Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. Captain Kaku, true to the Bushido Code, chose to go down with his ship. At 05:10 hours on June 5th, Hiryu rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves, taking with her the last remnants of Japanese ambitions at Midway. The 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were now 4 pyres on the ocean floor, their destruction marking the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. June 5th, 1942. Dawn, the morning sun, rose over a Pacific Ocean littered with the debris of shattered dreams and broken ambitions. Where Admiral Yamamoto had envisioned a triumphant Japanese fleet dictating terms to a defeated America, only oil slicks and floating wreckage marked the graves of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the 4 carriers that had spearheaded Japan's early victories across the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz received the preliminary battle reports at Pearl Harbor with cautious satisfaction. The impossible had happened. His outnumbered fleet had not merely survived, but had inflicted a devastating defeat on the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yet he knew the cost had been significant. The USS Yorktown, despite heroic damage control efforts, had finally succumbed to her wounds and torpedo damage, sinking at dawn on June 7th while under tow. The human cost was staggering but uneven. Japan had lost approximately 3,000 personnel, including many of their most experienced carrier pilots, men who had taken years to train and were irreplaceable. The Americans had lost 307 men, including the brave torpedo bomber crews who had sacrificed themselves to draw down the Japanese combat air patrol at the crucial moment. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, whose innovative Thatch Weave fighter tactics had helped American pilots survive against the superior Zero fighters, later wrote in his after-action report, "The enemy's overconfidence and our foreknowledge of their plans created an opportunity that our pilots seized with extraordinary courage." His assessment captured the perfect storm of intelligence, tactics, and heroism that had made victory possible. Context referenced from Edwin P. Hoyt's Blue Skies and Blood. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Japan's shipbuilding capacity, already strained by a global war, could not quickly replace 4 fleet carriers. More critically, the loss of experienced aircrew represented a blow from which Japanese naval aviation would never fully recover. The Kido Butai, the fast carrier strike force that had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, effectively ceased to exist as an offensive weapon. For Admiral Yamamoto, the defeat represented a personal and professional catastrophe. His prediction to the Japanese government that he could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months had proven eerily accurate. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The architect of Japan's early successes now faced the reality that his nation's strategic position in the Pacific had fundamentally shifted. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, rescued from the sinking Yorktown, would later reflect on the battle's significance. "We went into Midway knowing we were outnumbered and outgunned. We came out knowing that courage and intelligence could overcome material disadvantage." His words echoed throughout the American Pacific Fleet as morale soared and confidence replaced the defensive mindset that had characterized the war's first 6 months. The Battle of Midway marked more than a tactical victory. It represented the turning point where American industrial capacity, technological innovation, and fighting spirit began to assert themselves against Japanese expansion. The goals of Operation MI, to destroy the American Pacific Fleet and secure Japan's defensive perimeter, had indeed disintegrated in Midway's firestorm. As the sun set on June 7, 1942, the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet steamed triumphantly back toward Pearl Harbor, their flight decks scarred but their crews vindicated. Behind them, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers rested on the Pacific floor, their destruction marking the beginning of Japan's inevitable retreat across the ocean they had once dominated. The rising sun was setting on the Japanese Empire, and the American Eagle was preparing to soar across the Pacific toward ultimate victory.